Today's occurrence happens in the hottest place in North America. When a group of international tourists planned a trip to Death Valley, things didn't go according to plan, and they vanished. In fact, a lot of what happened to them remains a mystery to this day, but what is known is that what happened was because of a common mistake that people still make every single year. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the real story of the Death Valley Germans. On July 8, 1996, 34-year-old Egbert Rimkus and his 11-year-old son, George Weber, flew from Frankfurt, Germany, to Seattle, Washington. He was accompanied by his 28-year-old girlfriend, Cornelia Meyer, and her 4-year-old son, Max. Right after landing in Seattle, they took another flight to Los Angeles, California, to start their planned vacation. Now, Egbert was known to be a go-getter and adventurous, so he was excited to explore Southern California. Like most places in America, you need a vehicle to get around here. So the group went to rent a vehicle. They went to Dollar Rent-A-Car and picked up a green 1996 Plymouth Voyager van with California license plates. Egbert didn't have his driver's license on him, so Cornelia rented the van under her name. They were planning to return the van on July 26th because they had tickets to fly back to Germany on July 27th. With all of that established, the Germans enjoyed their first week or so in America by staying in the San Clemente area in Southern California. They did normal touristy things, sightseeing and probably spending way too much money on overpriced activities. They also took a lot of pictures on their Praktica 35mm camera. A few days after arriving on July 12th, Egbert called his bank in Dresden to have $1,500 wired to a Bank of America branch in San Clemente. Unfortunately, the money was sent to the Bank of America branch in Los Angeles, so it's unknown if Egbert got it. The group traveled to the California coast before going to Las Vegas, Nevada, and staying at the Treasure Island Hotel. On July 21st, Egbert sent a fax from the hotel to his ex-wife and mother of his son, Heike Weber, asking if she could send him money. She didn't send anything, and Egbert and Cornelia and their children checked out of the hotel the next day. At this point, they were probably low on funds, considering his ex-wife didn't send him anything when he asked. So trying to figure out their next move until their flight out of Los Angeles in a few more days, they went to the Furnace Creek Visitor Center after they left the hotel. While they were there, the Death Valley National Monument Museum text in the German language caught their eyes, and it told them what their next move was. They could do an adventurous camping and sightseeing trip going to Yosemite through Death Valley. They didn't have enough money to rent a room at Furnace Creek, but they could purchase some camping supplies and have an outdoor adventure. Before they left the visitor center, they asked a few questions about camping and what was and wasn't allowed. So they knew the temperatures on the floor of the valley were around 124 degrees Fahrenheit or 51 Celsius, so they couldn't camp there. It also just wasn't allowed. The maps the Germans had showed them a way west on the West Side Road. They could go through Butte Valley and Mangle Pass before going past Barker Ranch and then north to a ghost town named Ballarat, and from there they could continue to Yosemite. Fun fact, or not so fun fact, Barker Ranch is Charles Manson's old hangout. Going west is also kind of their only option because there were several places to camp on the west side of the valley, but there weren't any on the east side. And by going up a side canyon, they'd be away from the heat on the valley floor and closer to the water in the Hanaupa Canyon. So that's what they did. They went to the store to purchase new sleeping bags and some other supplies, and then spent the night of July 22nd camping at the top of Hanaupa Canyon. To get there, they had to drive through dirt roads, and the van managed to get up in the Hanaupa Canyon all right, which was exciting for their first time in the backcountry. That night, they took pictures on their camera and made the most of their vacation. They planned to spend the next 3 nights before their flight back on their trip through Yosemite, which they planned to reach the following night before traveling to Los Angeles. Early the next morning, they left Hanaupa Canyon, hoping to beat the heat. They went south to Warm Spring Road. At that point, what they're driving on is a very fine dirt road. As the Germans approached the Warm Spring camp, they stopped because from the road it looked like an active settlement. There were several chipped old concrete cabins built in the 1930s by a woman named Louise Grantham, who was one of the richest miners in Death Valley. She used to live there and had cooking staff to serve meals at the dining hall in the camp, where she and her workers lived. They wanted to ask someone about the rest of their journey and possibly how the road was further west. However, the Warm Spring camp was completely empty. It was part of the Death Valley Nature Preserve, so it was deserted and had been for decades. But people could still find shelter from the sun in the cabins and shade trees there. They could drink fresh water from the nearby mountain spring too. At the edge of the camp, there was a pole with a metal box holding a visitor's log. Cornelia signed the register with their names and made a note in German under it that they were going through the pass. Since Mengel Pass was right past that camp, that's where it's assumed she meant they were going. They continued their journey towards Butte Valley with their vague visitor's map, and this is where the road started to be questionable at best. The road wasn't the best for driving a van on. It was difficult, but they had already gone this far, so they wanted to keep going. And the sketchy road didn't last too long, so Egbert was able to manage to get through that portion of the road and onto an easier driving section in Butte Valley. While they were driving, they came up to an intersection and saw a stone cabin nearby that looked like someone's home. The Germans pulled up to the cabin to see if there was anyone there they could speak to about directions and the road going forward. Except the cabin was empty besides some food and a few American flags. The cabin was known as the Geologist Cabin, and it's maintained by volunteers so visitors have shelter. But not finding people there to provide directions, the Germans left. They took an American flag with them, and they continued to Mengel Pass. And the road just kept getting worse. At some point, they realized that the van just wasn't going to continue on anymore, and they needed to turn back. But by now, it was late in the afternoon, and it would take at least 2 hours to turn and make it back to the paved road in the valley, and it was also the complete opposite direction that they needed to go in. Not to mention how rough the ride was to this point. They weren't looking forward to driving back through it, but they were running out of time if they wanted to make it to Yosemite and then LA after that for their flight. There was one other option though. Their pamphlet showed a shorter route back to the valley using a road down Anvil Canyon. So that's what they tried. They turned around and went back to the intersection at the stone cabin and turned right onto Anvil Canyon Road. The Germans felt pretty confident in this decision because for the first mile or so, the road was fine. They knew they turned in the right direction because at the intersection was a huge guidepost and landmark showing the way in and out of Butte Valley. By the time they made it to the mouth of the canyon, the roads were okay, and then a bit past the mouth, the road was suddenly not okay. The road was washy, and with the van being a front-wheel drive, it felt like unless Egbert kept the car moving, it would stop. So Egbert pushed the van as fast as he could, trying to get back to the main canyon, but soon the rocks in the road started flattening the rear tires. Since the van was front-wheel drive, they could keep moving, but not as fast. They kept moving like that for more than 2 miles before they came to a fork in the so-called road. Egbert thought the road veered right, when really it went left, which caused him to try and correct his mistake at the last second. But the van got stuck in this sandy, gravelly area on the side of the washy road. At this point, their elevation was high enough that the temperature where they were was 104 degrees Fahrenheit rather than the 124 degrees on the floor of the valley. Very hot, but not quite deadly yet. Their main issue was finding someone to help them get their vehicle out from where it was stuck and making it back to LA before their flight. So Cornelia stayed with Max and George in the van while Egbert grabbed a beer and walked a little under 2 miles east down Anvil Canyon looking for anyone or anything that could help. He ended up sitting under a bush while drinking his bottle, and he could see down to the mouth of Anvil Canyon, about 8 miles away, all the way to the east side of the main valley where the paved road is about 16 miles away. Egbert sat there running through his options and decided the best course of action. Now, he wasn't from America, but he was familiar with the idea that military installations in Europe are regularly patrolled by armed guards. Looking at his map, he could see the northern boundary of the China Lake Naval Weapons Center, about 9 miles south of where he was now. At the top of the canyon, it didn't seem that far away, and it was a closer option than the paved Badwater Road. It was also a route that required them to stay higher up to travel so they wouldn't have to go to the higher temperatures down below on the floor of the valley. What Egbert didn't know was typically, yes, military installations in America, just like Europe, do have armed guards, but in the desert, there are hardly any fences and even less patrolmen on the ground. Because of where they're at, the sheer scope of land, not to mention the heat, provides better security than fences and men. And what Egbert couldn't see was the small group of runners on the valley floor near Badwater running their annual 135-mile or 217-kilometer desert race. The race began around the same time they started realizing they were lost, and prior to that, the extreme athletes were there for a while, acclimating to the heat. All of the runners were vetted by a team of organizers and had been training for months to do this. The course went from the lowest point in North America, out of Death Valley National Park, to the tallest peak in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, Mount Whitney. The runners were followed the entire way by support personnel, especially considering the record high temperatures that year. But oblivious to all of this, Edgar left his bottle by the bush and went back to the van. That night, they stayed by the van and camped and played and took a bunch of touristy pictures. Then, early the next morning, the Germans locked the vehicle before moving on foot down Anvil Canyon to where Egbert sat at the bush the day before, and then continuing on, turning south, towards the China Lake Naval Weapons Center. Now, they were familiar with the fact that they were just at Stone Cabin, and Stone Cabin was right by Anvil Spring, so a good source of water and shelter 4 miles back. But at this point, the Germans were completely unaware of how dire their situation actually was because they were so focused on making that flight back. They were positive they would find soldiers at the weapons center to help them, or just anyone really, even though they had yet to see a single person since going this way. After walking a few more miles, the Germans reached higher ground on a hilly area where they could see what was ahead of them. When they got to this point, they didn't see a military facility, and as puzzling as it probably was, it's believed it wasn't until that point that Egbert and Cornelia realized they were now in a survival situation. They have no idea where they are, they're in 100+ degree weather, they have no way to find help, and they have 2 young children with them. From here, it's believed that Egbert left Cornelia and their children somewhere possibly shaded before he continued on to try and find help, and Egbert never returned. On July 27, 1996, 2 things happened. The marathon runners left Death Valley, and Heike Weber, in Germany, waited for her 10-year-old son, George, to come back home. By the next day, George and Heike Weber's ex-husband, Egbert, were nowhere to be found. And looking back, Heike realized the last time she heard from Egbert was when he faxed her to ask for money from Treasure Island Resort in Las Vegas, Nevada. That was over a week ago, and she didn't bother sending him anything anyway. He was on the trip with his girlfriend and her son, after all. But now that son and ex-husband hadn't contacted her after their trip to America, she had questions. And over the next few days, those questions led to more questions until July 31st, when the German travel agency, Egbert, and the people he was with started begging a U.S. rental car company for information. One fax from the German travel agency said, quote, "We worry," end quote. The American employee on the receiving end of that communication and being hounded for information was bewildered and didn't have much to offer because they didn't have a clue on Egbert's whereabouts, let alone the car they rented to him. Both the German and U.S. companies reported the missing tourist to Interpol, but without information on where to begin investigating, no real progress was made. It wasn't until late October, when a missing Voyager van was spotted in Death Valley, that things changed. Death Valley is located in eastern California and close to the border of California and Nevada. It's a national park in the northern Mojave Desert, and it's not only the hottest place in North America, but it holds the record for the highest recorded air temperature on Earth, at approximately 134 degrees Fahrenheit or 57 Celsius. That being said, it's around a 7-hour drive to the Mexican border, around 2 hours drive to Las Vegas, Nevada, and within reasonable proximity to major California cities. Because of that, the area is monitored for trafficking and illegal activity. So on October 21st, a military helicopter was doing its routine drug surveillance, flying over the southern part of Death Valley. Death Valley National Park Ranger Dave Brenner was inside, looking for drug manufacturing labs in the backcountry. Around 11 a.m., he flew over Anvil Canyon and spotted the van. It was odd because the van was found around 2.5 miles downstream from Willow Springs, which is at the head of the canyon. And where the van was, there wasn't an actual road. There used to be, because at one point it was the only route through there to Butte Valley that miners could use. But after talc mines were opened in Warm Spring Canyon, north of there, a dirt road was developed for large trucks to get through west of Butte Valley. But 2 years prior to the van being spotted, the Desert Protection Act was passed, and Anvil Canyon became part of the official wilderness area, so vehicle use was banned there. Now, some of the locals still chose to drive through the area, even though they weren't supposed to, but that's the second part of what was strange, because the locals didn't use vans to break the law. You could only navigate in Anvil Canyon with a solid 4-wheel drive vehicle. Anything less than that, and you're not getting far. So Dave landed nearby and, upon closer inspection, realized that the green van was clearly abandoned and covered in dust. It was a 1996 Plymouth Voyager van and had California license plates. Once he got closer, he realized the van was stuck up to its axles in sand. Its front left tire and its 2 rear tires were flat, and the tracks leading up to it indicated that it drove for 200 feet with the rear ones flat. Dave tried to open the van, but it was locked, so he radioed the license plate number to Death Valley National Park headquarters. Headquarters had California Highway Patrol run the information, and the van came back as being reported stolen by Los Angeles Police Department a month prior. The van was rented to 4 German tourists in Los Angeles on July 8, 1996, from Dollar Rent-A-Car. It was supposed to be returned July 26th, but never was, and with the policy being to wait 30 days before reporting it stolen, that's what the company did. But now, looking up the names of the Germans who rented the van pulled up the Interpol alert from August. 34-year-old Egbert Rimkus and his 11-year-old son, George Weber, along with Egbert's girlfriend, 28-year-old Cornelia Meyer, and her 4-year-old son, Max Meyer. From what they could tell, all 4 of them flew from Frankfurt, Germany, to Seattle, Washington on July 8th, and then immediately flew to Los Angeles, California to pick up that rental van. Cornelia was the reported driver since Egbert didn't have his license, and they never returned the van, and they never boarded their return flight. There wasn't anything pointing to them leaving America at all. Death Valley National Park investigator Eric Inman was helicoptered to the van around 10 a.m. the next day and peeked into the window. He saw a child's shoe on the seat, and immediately his heart broke because he knew what that shoe inside of an empty car meant. Eric also did an initial search and photographed the area. There were some food wrappers near the van, toilet paper, and some human waste, but the only footprints nearby were Dave's from the day before. There wasn't much to go on in the immediate area, so an hour later, Eric took the helicopter back to Badwater Road in Death Valley to meet people from the sheriff's office. After some discussion, the people from the sheriff's office drove to where the van was located, and Eric flew back to the van a few hours later. Now, with the police there, Eric was able to open the van doors and look through everything inside. They found beverages of all sorts, like 2 unopened bottles of beer and 1 empty bottle, 1 empty and 1 3/4 full bottle of bourbon, along with several empty large juice and water containers. They found some camping supplies, like a new sleeping bag still in its box, and 1 empty sleeping bag box, along with the tent. There was luggage and clothing and a ton of exposed rolls of camera film, along with the camera for it, a pipe with tobacco, a letter card carrier containing Swiss bank cards, and a city credit card for Egbert. A card from the Seahorse Resort Hotel in San Clemente. There were a bunch of toys and an unused compact spare tire and car jack. But the thing that was the most important out of all of those was the American flag found in the car that had the label for the Butte Valley Store cabin. The cabin was located in Butte Valley, 4.1 miles west of where the van was located in Anvil Canyon. It was the geologist's cabin and was known to be very comfortable and somewhat stocked with food, with plenty of good water near it via the spring. The next day around 2 p.m., the sheriff's office had the van removed from the canyon and stored in their impound lot. That same day, rangers at headquarters found the visitor's logbook that Cornelia signed. And after searching nearby places they could have stayed, like the Furnace Creek Ranch, or in the Furnace Creek Campground, or the Stovepipe Wells Resort, a search group was put together. The China Lake Mountain Rescue Group, 8 mounted units from the County Sheriff's Search and Rescue, 9 trackers from the Indian Wells Valley Search and Rescue, and more started looking for signs of what happened to the missing tourist. The first search revealed the beer bottles by the bush in Anvil Canyon that Egbert stopped at. They could see his rear print in the sand next to the bottle, which told them that a larger person sat there trying to find shade. The next day, October 24th, they brought more search and rescue teams and expanded the search area. They also brought in some helicopters to help search and to help move supplies and searchers around. The day after that, now day 3 of the search, was even bigger. It went from the area between the mouth of Anvil Canyon and the far side of the main valley at Badwater Road to having teams search the outer perimeter of Butte Valley to the west side of Mango Pass. They had a team searching the north from Anvil Canyon over the mountains. They went almost everywhere, north, west, east, and southeast. The helicopters were back too, and day 4 was even larger. They had teams all over, and at any given time, at least 45 searchers were in the field with 2 helicopters in the air and 8 horses on the ground. A total of 250 people were helping with the search at some point, costing $80,000, which today equals almost $161,000. And even with all of that, nothing was found beyond the bottle on day 1 of the search. And that's kind of where things sat for over a decade. Except they didn't have all the information I told you about the Germans at the beginning. All they really knew at that point was that the tourists came to America, they stayed at a resort, and they visited the tourist center. Egbert sat by the bush, and none of them got on a flight back home. And from this, all sorts of conspiracy theories were thrown around. From alien abductions, to the tourists running away to start a new life, to Egbert being in a custody battle with his ex-wife and wanting George to himself. There were even talks of Egbert annihilating everyone else and then himself, or taking them out and starting a new life on his own. The theories were everywhere, and there was no evidence of any sort, not even circumstantial evidence, for any of them. And it wasn't until a private citizen by the name of Tom Mahood caught wind of the story and, with his experience in search and rescue, decided to unravel the mystery. He went out as a private citizen to Death Valley and almost died, but he eventually formulated possible routes and choices that the Germans could have made based on the fact that they didn't know what many local to the area would have known. By all appearances, it seemed as if the searchers originally in '96 were looking at it from a viewpoint of what would people familiar with this environment possibly do, rather than what sort of series of mistakes would someone make who has no idea what they're doing out here in Death Valley. So Tom knew that with all of the extensive searching, everyone looked everywhere but directly south. And his search was obviously much more complicated than this, but to sum it up, everything I described to you about the Germans' trip at the beginning are what he kind of pieced together. So if you're not familiar with Death Valley and this kind of rocky, sandy terrain, you may not know that you have to have a 4-wheel drive to be able to navigate that area. The mom van they were using is not making it through that terrain. It doesn't matter how skilled of a driver you think you are. And the vague map the Germans were using showed this alternative, shorter route that actually wasn't a route at all. It was a mistake on the map. What they were following were boundary lines and things of that nature, but it wasn't indicating an actual road. They also wouldn't have realized that there aren't people just out there walking around and patrolling. You can drive through that part of the country on an actual road and not see a single gas station or another car for hours or days at a time, depending on where you're at, where you're going, and how fast you're traveling. A lot of the investigation into their disappearance was classified to discourage people from going out to the area that weren't qualified to be there. But after pestering enough people, Tom was able to get his hands on the information that was kept from the public. Now, obviously it was hidden to discourage people from doing exactly what Tom is about to do, but being trained and familiar with surviving in that type of environment, Tom was able to get his hands on this information. He got Les Walker, who I believe is another volunteer rescuer, to go out to the area with him again. After he almost died the first time, he went alone, and they spread out over the area south where he believed the Germans may have gone. Looking at all the ground they had to cover, Tom believed it would take several trips back out there to cover all of the area. So he and Les spread out far enough to where they needed to use radios to communicate, but not so far that they couldn't help each other if one got into trouble. And during their first trip out there one morning, Les radioed Tom saying he found a wine bottle with the label, which was kind of strange and a letdown at first for Tom. It had been 13 years at this point. There was no way a label would still be on a bottle if it was from the Germans. But then Les said it wasn't a full label, just pieces of a label on the bottle, which Tom figured wouldn't be enough to get searchers to the area. But he continued searching where he was at, a little glum because Les was finding all of the interesting things. And then Tom's radio went off again. Les told him that he could see toilet paper in the bushes, which was weird because toilet paper would not last long in that environment at all. And then Les tells him, no, it's not toilet paper. It looks like it's pages from a planner with writing in German. This got Tom's hopes back up, but he had to finish searching his location before he could go to Les. And while he was continuing, Les radioed him one more time, saying, quote, Tom, we have some bones here, end quote. And at that point, Tom made his way to Les. By the time he got there, Les had found a wallet full of ID cards belonging to Cornelia Meyer. Continuing to look in the area surrounding that, they found what looked to be scattered skeletal remains, personal hygiene items like a toothbrush and toothpaste, and the remains of a small shoe belonging to a woman or a child. Investigating further, they found parts of Cornelia's planner that had several business cards from the places they visited in America. They also found another beer bottle, and honestly, things got more confusing the more they looked, because by all appearances, it looked like they were only seeing the remains of one person, Cornelia. Everything they had found to this point belonged to her too. They couldn't seem to find a trace of Egbert or the kids, and beyond that, they were kind of impressed, because where they were meant that they had to hike 9 miles over rough terrain in street shoes in July. And this is the sort of terrain that even experienced people struggle to get through. So for the Germans to have potentially traveled this far on foot with barely more than the clothes on their back shows a lot of grit. So with all of this, Tom and Les went to the Death Valley National Park headquarters at Furnace Creek and brought some of Cornelia's IDs for proof that they weren't crazy fanatics assuming things that weren't true. They didn't touch any of the skeletal remains. They only packed up the wallet with the ID cards because they knew they wouldn't damage that on their journey back. They knew by the time they made it back to the station, it would be closed or close to closing, and since at the time of the search there wasn't a cell tower in the area, they had to find the perfect spot where Les's phone would connect. Tom sent off an email and left a voicemail with one of the original searchers that helped them, and then they quickly made their way to the station. They got there 2 minutes after closing and saw visitors outside standing around looking at a map, so they put on some rescue gear from their organization and walked up to the glass, hoping that a ranger would let them in and take them serious. Luckily she did, and from there they filled the rangers in. They read out their statements, they answered questions, typical things you have to do when you're reporting that you found human remains somewhere no one is supposed to be. The sheriff's office went out to lightly search the area and investigate over the next couple of days, while Tom and Les went home and were asked to keep quiet from the press so that the location wouldn't be compromised. The major search was delayed until early December, and for the most part, Tom was kept out of the loop. That is until they actually went back for the big search and wanted his input on where things could be. They found some more skeletal remains scattered about, but due to the weather deterioration over time, DNA wasn't found. In March of 2010, Tom went back out to search alone and found a set of keys that looked like European house keys. Tom went back in April with someone else and found a much more pleasant and probable route that the Germans most likely took. At some point, they were high up on the hill overlooking the valley trying to find the most plausible route exhausted tourists with 2 children would have taken to get down into the valley, when suddenly they spotted an old 4x4 wood post with red paint at the top, set with some large rocks around it. It had an amber beer bottle on top of the rocks, and it looked like a marker of some sort. The company manufacturing the drink closed in 1985, so they knew the bottle was made prior to that. They made note of the area and left it, and about a month later, a deputy called Tom to tell him that they managed to match DNA with some of the previously recovered bones to Egbert, but they hadn't been able to make DNA progress on the female skeletal remains, and they still hadn't found anything concrete linking to the children. Tom made a few more trips out there with other people who were willing to help search, and by November of 2010, they still hadn't found the children. Tom was pretty set on that being his last trip out there, without a significant development happening to make him come out. It was just too hard on him to keep going. But a few weeks later, he received a call from the deputy again that another search revealed more information. The remains that are suspected to be Cornelia's were sent to a more advanced DNA lab for testing. Some skeletal fragments possibly belonging to George were discovered, but 4-year-old Max's remains have never been located. The investigators understandably regularly withheld information from Tom and didn't reveal locations that they found with evidence to him. So it's unknown if they did end up looking into the post with the rocks. That seems like it could have been a marker or a burial site, or if they found any more information on that. If they did, they didn't tell Tom, but Tom believes that after the parents gave out from the heat, the children may have kept going. As far as I can tell, the remains of both the parents have been suspected to have been found, regardless of DNA matching. As for the children, it's suspected that they perished out in the desert, even though there hasn't been any public reveals on if anything linked to the children have been found out there. However, the sheriff's office did make it clear that if they found any new information or any more remains or anything, that they would be sending all of it to the families of the German tourist, and that anything new found out in the desert, they didn't want. They didn't want any more searching or investigating or anything of the sort to be done out there. The Death Valley German story is a sad but common case of people not understanding the dangers they're in until it's too late, especially in regards to hiking or any kind of activity in hot weather. Understandably, these were tourists, but considering that Death Valley gets so many tourists, especially from Germany, visiting there every year, it's so important to prepare appropriately and to keep away from outdoor hikes during the hottest time of the year. It has the name Death Valley for a reason. And actually, even earlier this year in July of 2024, 6 German motorcyclists were going through Death Valley, and 2 of them suffered from heat-related illnesses. One rider was pronounced dead at the scene, and the other was taken to a hospital for treatment. He, along with 2 other members of the group, were taken 19 miles to Furnace Creek Visitor Center for help, and the severely ill one was taken to a hospital in Nevada by ambulance, and then to another hospital in Las Vegas by helicopter. Rescuers going to help them couldn't even take a helicopter to them because it was so hot out there that the helicopter wouldn't work. It was 128 degrees Fahrenheit, or 53 Celsius, and helicopters can't safely operate in over 120-degree weather. And like here in Texas, they really drill it into your head to not hike during certain times of the year. And if you're going to take the chance, you need to make sure you're doing it very early in the morning and that you have contingencies in place for if things go wrong and you need help. And still, even in October of this year, there are people dying on the trails from the heat. Now, October is usually when weather cools down, but in the South, it's still pretty hot. There was a woman found alone out on the trails, and at the time of this recording, the cause of death hasn't been established, but everyone's leaning towards it being from the heat. Now, it wasn't 100 plus that day, but it was still pretty hot, and after the heat index hits 99 degrees, not even the wind provides relief. And typically on the trails and in the desert, there can be areas with no shade and no water. There's no relief. So if you're going to be adventuring in hotter weather, then you need to have a plan to make sure you're not going to be actively on the trails during high heat times of the day. You really should not be alone on the trails, and if you are, you should check in with the ranger station prior to heading out, so that hopefully at least someone nearby is aware that you're out there. And in the case of the Texas woman, it took quite a bit before they realized her car had been parked in the lot and not moved, before they realized there's probably someone out on the trails in need of help. They put together that they hadn't given out any backpackers or overnight passes for that area that day. Always make sure you have plenty of water and salty snacks, and if possible, a GPS tracker for trusted friends or family to track you, because a lot of the times there's no cell service, or have an emergency beacon so that emergency services can find you. However, just like with the motorcyclist faced, you still need to set yourself up to be in the best position for a rescue. Like if you're super far off the trails and it's really hot out, people are going to have a very hard time getting to you. But honestly, the best course of action is to just not do it until the weather permits, unless you're extremely experienced in those conditions. But I digress. Stay safe, and see you next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.